Old San Francisco, BC. I lived with my true love and she lived with me.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we deep dive into the Postal Telegraph branch office, 405 Brannan Street, San Francisco, 1927. Okay, we're back in Saroyan's good graces. He's no longer teasing us about French brothels and daring us to keep liking him. This chapter is much drier and relates the story of the brief moment that he was a manager, in fact, the youngest manager in the country, of a Postal Telegraph Company branch in San Francisco. Here we learn a bit more about Saroyan's value system and what led him to abandon big business entirely to become his own boss. Becoming a self-made entrepreneur is probably much more difficult than being an office drone, but some people simply aren't made for the petty politics of the office, preferring the petty politics of life itself. Saroyan describes working at the Postal Telegraph Company in 1927. He wanted a raise and was given a branch to manage. His boss tells him that he'll get a raise if he can improve business in the branch. It's a big branch covering at least part of downtown San Francisco. He does manage to increase business threefold, but the manager doesn't give him a raise. So he quits, and he concludes, "The money is stingy, but it really isn't anywhere near as clever as it thinks it is. Had the money not revealed itself as a stupid thief, I might have lingered a year or two longer in the business world." Of course, he had already been introduced to questionable business practices working in the vineyards in Fresno. He rejected it there, and he rejected it in San Francisco. In fact, he would continue to reject scandalous business practices his whole life, which, of course, didn't endear him to the Hollywood and New York crowds. It's worth digging into the process he went through to improve business at his branch, if only because it's truly a different world from the one we live in now. By the time Saroyan died in 1981, technology had advanced greatly in the realm of telecommunications. Of course, the leap between 1981 and 2021 is potentially even greater. So most people reading this chapter today will probably be at sea trying to figure out what Saroyan is talking about. First, he's making $20 a week and wants more. Even in 1927, $20 a week wasn't a great wage. Most union workers across the country, regardless of the field, made closer to $30 to $40 a week. San Francisco, as a county and city, can't support much more than around 700,000 people living there. And in 1950, it hit that mark and has remained there. In 1930, the population was already 634,000, and that's a lot of telegrams floating around. In San Francisco, telegraphers could make $275 a week, much more than most cities. Even then, San Francisco wages apparently had to be high to retain workers. So, as a manager, Saroyan is possibly making less than the telegraphers in his office. And this is all part of the whole story he's weaving about how he became 1972 Saroyan. How the largely unregulated world of business abused its workers, and how he decided to write on behalf of the little guy, for the little guy. A blue-collar writer. It's also perhaps perplexing to a 21st century reader when he goes into detail about checking all of his call boxes in this chapter. What is this? Telegrams are the messages transmitted by the telegraph, which was the apparatus used by telegraphers. Telegraphs used Morse code to transmit messages via electric pulses over wires. Morse code is a language consisting of dots and dashes. Telegraphers were trained to read these dots and dashes, often audibly, as the electric impulses both made sounds and caused levers with electromagnets, to transcribe the dots and dashes onto paper. Think beep, 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 beep. That noise. A telegrapher creating the message would move the lever on their end, and the lever on the other end would automatically repeat the message. The telegrapher on the receiving end would then translate the dots and dashes back into English, write the message, and give it to a messenger to deliver to the right party. From his writings, it doesn't sound like Saroyan ever became a telegrapher, but was mostly a messenger, and being the messenger suited him just fine given his impatience and need to keep moving. Call boxes were distributed to businesses that sent a lot of telegrams. So a business would activate the Postal Telegraph call box, which alerted Postal that their customer wanted to send a telegram. Postal would then dispatch a messenger to the business to retrieve the message, bring it back to Postal, where a telegrapher would transmit it to another office, presumably far away, where a messenger would then deliver to the recipient. So this was the first task of fixing up the Brannan office, checking to make sure that all of the call boxes were in working order. Possibly, a business was trying to alert Postal and the box was failing, meaning lost business and potentially a competitor like Western Union getting a call. So William contacts a dozen companies with postal call boxes and goes to them. From each location, he would call May McGarry, a receptionist at the desk, to see if the call box he was activating was alerting her. Then he contacted the businesses that weren't using Postal Telegraph call boxes regularly, about 150 customers. He grew branch business so widely that he had to hire 8 new messengers, who he tells us were Filipino, and that May McGarry liked them because they were so thoughtful and courteous. This is a tangent worth mentioning for anyone interested in the American immigration story. First, this is not the first time Saroyan wrote about this immigrant group. In 1935, he published the story The Filipino and the Drunkard, about a young Filipino man being harassed by a white drunkard, eventually killing the drunkard. In 1936, he published Our Little Brown Brothers, the Filipinos, an ironic take on a racist term popularized by William Howard Taft during U.S. colonial rule of the Philippines in 1904. In Saroyan's story, a Filipino prize fighter, a huge man defying stereotypes of Asian weakness, fights off his opponent, his manager, the police, a mob, to prove that he is the stronger fighter. In 1938, he published 1924 Cadillac for Sale, where a dapper young Filipino man and his friends fix up an old jalopy, despite the car seller believing it was a doomed attempt. In all of these stories, and in others with Filipino characters, we find a sympathetic, if not fascinated, motif around Filipinos, their resilience, the ways they don't represent the terrible anti-Asian stereotypes that were filling California. They may be the most celebrated minority in Saroyan's oeuvre. From 1920 to 1935, there were around 39,000 Filipino men living in San Francisco. Legislation forbade them to own land or businesses, so they became a transient population, working as laborers in low-level positions. Often in the summer, they would work on farms, and in the winter would work low-wage jobs in cities. This is probably why Saroyan also encountered them in the fruit packing houses of Fresno. Like many immigrants, without certain rights, they had to move around to survive. Around Kearny and Jackson in San Francisco, Manila Town was established, and this was a sort of home base for Filipinos of the region. The International Hotel was the center of Manila Town. As mentioned in Chapter 3's analysis, the 1970s saw a redevelopment effort in San Francisco known as urban renewal. In the Fillmore, it targeted the Black community. In downtown, it targeted the Filipino community. This led to mass protests that ultimately resulted in the riot police winning. The International Hotel was torn down and the land left vacant. Once again, San Francisco city leaders displaced minorities in the city. Filipino immigrants for a short time were automatically U.S. nationals thanks to American colonialism at the beginning of the 20th century. They weren't exactly welcomed with open arms, but they did replace many Chinese, Korean, Indian, and Japanese laborers who were restricted by the Immigration Acts of 1917 and 1924 that targeted Asians. As colonial subjects of America, Filipinos were exempt from these anti-Asian laws. As Filipino women were not allowed to immigrate in the same numbers, Filipino men began to date local women, inflaming the nativist white rural farmer types. Filipino men would go to taxi dances, the pay to dance with women phenomenon which we learned about in Chapter 7's analysis. Basically, there was widespread mingling between Filipino men and white women, all of whom were having a good time. This led to mob violence in 1930 in the coastal farming town of Watsonville, California, where local angry white men violently attacked members of the Filipino community. The violence spread to nearby towns, including Stockton, San Francisco, and San Jose. In 1933, a California law outlawed Filipino white marriages, an expansion of an existing anti-miscegenation law, and Filipino immigration was restricted to 50 people per year. All of these anti-Asian orders opened the door to Mexican immigration in agricultural jobs that is still the norm today. That was a sizable tangent, but this is what was going on in Saroyan's California. Back to the chapter, why did Saroyan write it? Saroyan believed you had to be your own advocate, that ultimately only you were responsible for yourself. And as we learn in later chapters, you're born alone and you die alone. In 1920 San Francisco, he learned a lot about how to be a self-advocate, and anyone who becomes a professional artist needs that to some extent to prove to everyone that they can make money doing something so degraded in a capitalist society. His time at the Postal Telegraph Company was incredibly influential in his life, and this is just another example of the necessity of putting your mental, emotional, and physical efforts into something important or something you really care about. Because in Saroyan's world, businessmen are just out to exploit their workers. This is a theme we find often in his work, with many autobiographical examples. Again, his early Marxist attitudes emerged in the 20s and 30s, and though he did sour on communism and its hypocritical applications, he continued to write about the equality and dignity of man. It's early experiences like this chapter that made him into the writer that many saw as a universalist, a writer committed to celebrating mankind as a whole. Sometimes he did fall short of this in his personal life, but the seeds were planted young, and it was a goal that he had at least tried to achieve through his writing. And this is the illustration he leaves us with at the end of the chapter. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.